Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I'm your host, Brian Locascio, and today's guest has been a credentialed music therapist since 1974. He completed his bachelor's and master's degrees in music therapy at the University of Kansas and a PhD in public health with a major in healthcare administration at Oregon State University. Between volunteer work, internship, and employment, he has worked at 9 different healthcare facilities in 5 states: California, Kansas, Oregon, Minnesota, and Arizona. His experience has been in psychiatric and substance abuse settings, both private and public. His longest place of employment was 25 years at Oregon State Hospital in Salem, Oregon. Let's give a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Ted Thicken.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Hello. Yes, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time today. So one of the first things I love asking our guests when they come onto the show is really to define music therapy. For all of us, it can be so different in the ways that we look at it and the ways that we've heard about it. So for you, how would you say you define music therapy?
Well, for me, it's the use of music to work on non-musical goals. So it could be to increase self-esteem. It could be physical rehabilitation. It could be increasing attention span. It's when I think of music education, it's working on music goals. When I think of music therapy, it's using music to work on non-musical goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say I definitely agree that that's the big majority of what we see. Do you think there's ever any crossover between the two?
Oh, absolutely. My degree from the University of Kansas were in music education / music therapy. So I had training in both. And certainly I think music therapists use their music education skills at different points, depending on the population they're working with and what the needs of those clients are. You might be giving guitar lessons as a way to raise self-esteem or help with organizational skills or other non-musical goals, but you're still teaching music. So I think there's an overlap.
Yes, I can definitely see it in the ways, especially at KU, how those two programs are working together. And that's being the case for a lot of universities as well. So what led you to music therapy? What did that path look like?
Oh boy. Well, it's been a long path. I think for me, it really started in the 3rd grade. I was in a church boys choir, and our choir director, who is still living and I keep in touch with, he took us Christmas caroling at nursing homes. And I think for me, that was my first chance to observe how music improved the quality of life of people living in nursing homes. And I could see the behavioral responses and the toes tapping and the faces smiling and people singing along, that remembering lyrics and they couldn't remember anything else. So I started to see the effects of music at an early age. All through college, I was basically my major instrument was voice. So I did a lot of singing in choirs, and at KU, I was in the KU pop ensemble. And
very cool.
I've just always loved music. I've always seen its effect on myself as well as its effect on everyone else. In fact, if you look at what's happening with COVID right now and look at all of the ways that music is being used for stress reduction and emotional regulation, and people singing off their balconies in Italy and people posting virtual concerts. And I mean, music's just playing a lot of roles as we go through the COVID situation. So, I started as a music major in college. Then I heard about music therapy. I went to 2 universities before I made it to KU. And when I finally got to KU, I found my home for music therapy. I interned with developmentally disabled clients in Southern California. And then I started working. And like you said, I've worked in several states. Most of my experience has been with psychiatric patients with mental health issues. But my favorite population to work with is drug addicts and alcoholics. So I've done a lot of work with substance abusers. That's it. I've really stayed active in the field of music therapy. I've present at conferences, and I've written some things and really been active in the American Music Therapy Association.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like that from the information that I was reading up on you and talking to you about prior to us getting on here. What led you to have that affinity towards like substance abuse groups and groups like that?
A variety of things. One of the places I worked was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I started there working just with adult mental health issues. But I got promoted to be supervisor of the music therapy department. And so one of the therapists was working with adolescent substance abusers, and I got to observe her a lot and talk with her a lot. And she and I did some writing together. So I think that's where I really got interested in that population. From there, I went to Arizona. I worked at a private psychiatric hospital. Also in Tucson, Arizona, I worked at a substance abuse treatment facility. I was working as their national aftercare provider or coordinator, but they let me give lectures on how to use music in recovery. So I started really researching that and developing that. When I got to Oregon later in my career, I was also doing some work with substance abusers and actually got a contract with the state of Oregon with an art therapist to develop a workshop for chemical dependency counselors on how to use music and art in their treatment programs. And we developed that and we offered it throughout our state. So, and there's a book called Music Therapy and Addictions that was published in England. And I submitted a chapter for that book and it was published. So that was really fun because I got to hear from music therapists all over the world that contributed chapters to that book and how they were using music in recovery.
Yeah, and what a great experience to kind of collect that type of information. And it sounds like you really took your passion forward and really innovated that field.
Yeah, it's been a learning experience for me. I think I've kept the conversation going with others and promoted that.
Well, I think that's a wonderful thing that you're doing and that you have done for the psychiatric part of music therapy, especially with substance abuse and things like that. What does it look like for you currently when it comes to music therapy?
Well, I left Oregon State Hospital after working there for 25 years. And I was actually laid off due to budget cuts. And at that point, I had moved into administration. I was working as director of standards and compliance for the hospital. So suddenly I was unemployed, but I had enough time in with the state to retire. So I retired instead of accepting layoff. And I just started getting involved. I was still doing some historical research in music therapy. And then I read this article. The title of the article was Music, Money, and Hate. And that just, made me aware of the hate music industry, which I did not know anything about. That was in 2014. And so I started researching it. I started reading everything I could get my hands on and talking to people and interviewing people and going to archives and finding out everything I could about music and hate. And as I learned about music and hate, it was such a stark contrast to my experience as a music therapist, where music was not used to spread hate. It was used to help and to heal. I just kept going with it until I thought, boy, this would make an interesting book. So then for 5 years, I started writing the book.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to our topic today, which is your book, Music of Hate, Music for Healing, Paired Stories from the Hate Music Industry and the Profession of Music Therapy. So it sounds like, a lot of times we look at music, especially with the perspective music therapist, as a very healing tool. And you kind of hear these buzzwords of, oh, music can be harmful. I think that your book is a really great application of seeing some of those negative effects of music as well.
Absolutely. Actually, I have a whole chapter about harmful effects of music that did not make it to the book. because the book was too long, and my editor and my publisher said, you need to cut it down. So that chapter got cut, but I still have it, and I make it available. If readers want to read that, I can send it to them. So we know that music has harmful effects. People have had musicogenic seizures listening to types of music. People have over-exercised to music and had negative results. People have been tortured to music or by music. So we know, and people have been shot and killed for playing their music too loud. So we know that there are less than positive uses of music and results. When I went through my music therapy training, there was really basically one textbook. It was called Music in Therapy, written by Ethayer Gaston, who was a professor at KU, a psychologist and a musician. And one of his quotes in that book was that music is derived from the tender emotions. And he talks about that, about patriotism and religion and other ways of using music, from the tender emotions. When I read the article about hate music, I thought, oh my goodness, that's not a tender emotion. So it made me want to know more about who are these people and why are they using music to spread hatred in the world.
Yes, it sounds like from everything you're saying, it kind of sparked this new lane in music and music therapy, kind of looking at the influence of, okay, older people who established the profession to some degree had this one perspective. And then as you're discovering, okay, we're hearing what hate music is, okay, who does it? There's this whole other aspect to music that we just haven't been looking at for a really long time as therapists or as clinicians in general. So that kind of sparks the question for me, who should read this book based on that? Is it just therapists? Is it any clinician? What are your thoughts?
Really good question. When I started talking to people about the book, and I said, it's going to be stories about hate music and then stories about music therapists, the reaction I got was, what's music therapy and what's hate music? So I discovered that a lot of people that I talked to weren't aware of either. So, and since I'm a music therapist and had my training and experience as a music therapist, I thought, well, here's an opportunity to write a book that's unusual, but it would educate the general public about the dangers of hate music, but also about the field of music therapy and what we do and why we do it. So I was looking to write a book of contrasts and juxtapositions and relationships. And my idea was by putting the stories side by side with each other, people would learn about both negative uses of music and positive uses of music in a way that they weren't aware of before. But because I chose to focus on music therapists for the music therapy half, I didn't really talk about other musicians. There's a lot of different music professions. Obviously, I started in a church choir, so there's choirs out there, community choruses, there's community orchestras, there's songwriters, there's engineers, recording engineers. There's all kinds of music professions that also could learn from what I've written about hate music and also can learn more about what is music therapy. A part of it was written for music therapists, a part of it was written for all musicians, and a part of it was written for the general public.
Focusing on that intentionality behind the music, it sounds like.
Yes.
And I hear you throwing around this term hate music, and obviously it's in the title of the book. So would you like to dive in a little bit and define how you view hate music and what that is?
Sure. As I told you, the article that I read originally called Music, Money, and Hate, and that was written by a gentleman named Keegan Hanks, who works at the Southern Poverty Law Center. So I started there. If you go to the website of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a private charity actually based in Montgomery, Alabama, they track hate groups nationally, and they do a lot of legal work to help people that have been discriminated against. If you go to their website, they have a map of the United States where they show all the hate groups that they have been tracking. And if you sort it, one of the sorts you can get is hate music. So it'll cut out everything else and just show you where the hate music groups are in the United States. So I started there and started looking into those groups. And I talked to the author of that article, Keegan Hanks, and he said, well, most of the people on our list for hate music are distributors. They're people that sell the music. He said it doesn't include individual artists or bands or other groups. So you're going to have to dig deeper to find out about those people. I also found out that the Anti-Defamation League, which fights against anti-Semitism, they also fight against any form of hatred. And they also track hate music groups. And on their website, they had lists of hate music groups in, I think, 30 different countries. So it wasn't just a problem in the United States. It's a worldwide problem. So I started learning more, and I started digging into not only the distributors, but also the publishers and the recording companies, the record companies, and then some individual artists. The Anti-Defamation League estimates that at any point there's between 100 and 150 bands in the United States that are playing hate music. But what is hate music? That's what you asked me. So hate music is music that attacks any demographic group as a whole group based on the color of their skin, their religion, their gender or their sexual identification, their geographic area. It's basically attacking a demographic group for things that they have no control over. And there are definitions I found online and in other books that I was reading, but what I found that hate music has some common characteristics, and they include a direct expression of hatred for a group. They're not subtle about it. They say, we hate such and such. They sometimes encourage violence against that group. They use taboo language or derogatory language. It could be racial slurs, profanity, name-calling. They perpetuate negative and false stereotypes, false narratives. In some cases, they encourage criminal behavior, such as assault and some of the violence. And in some cases, it's very what would be labeled by diagnosticians in mental health. It's antisocial. So some of these people have antisocial behavior disorders, meaning that they have no empathy for other people. They don't care who they hurt, and they have no remorse for expressing their hatred. Now, hate music is not my title. That came from a lot of the literature I was reviewing. So I use it as the title of my book and also during the book, but I didn't come up with it. And it really goes across genres and across styles of music. My definition was focused more on the common characteristics, and some of the music might not have all 5 of those common characteristics. It might have 1 of them, or it might have 3 of them, or it might have 5 of them. So I encourage, when I talk to groups, I encourage them, when you listen to examples, check off, do they have these 5 characteristics, or do they only have 3 of them? That's how I define it.
Well, thank you for doing that too. And that's a great way for us to utilize music, whether recreationally or therapeutically, to really assess what we're listening to and the effects that it might have. Now, when you were looking into the research of all these different groups that are producing these types of music, all these different producers and things like that, were there groups that, like minority groups or demographic groups, that were more subjected to hate music than others, like where certain populations experience it more?
Well, I found a lot of different demographic groups that were, attacked by hate music. There was anti-Semitic music, anti-Black music, there's anti-white music, anti-immigrant music, anti-LGBTQ plus music, anti-disabled music, and a very large group of misogynist music.
Yeah.
So I would say out of the groups that I studied to this point, the neo-Nazi skinhead music was probably the largest group, the extremist groups, followed by misogynist music.
Well, thank you for filling me in on that kind of information. I'm sure the listeners are wondering that too. I know misogyny in music has been pretty common throughout the decades and different forms. And I could go on and on about genres, but this is about you. So I kind of want to keep asking you all those questions. So when we hear hate music, and thank you for defining that, I'm sure both the listeners and I begin to have a variety of ideas pop into our heads, especially now that you've given us this idea of the different demographics that are often targeted and the big variety of hate music that does exist. What are some examples of the categories of hate music?
Well, I mentioned white supremacist music and neo-Nazi skinhead music. There's new genres, though. Some authors refer to it as hatecore music. I think a little over a year ago, maybe 2 years now, there was a shooting in Dayton, Ohio, and the shooter, it was a mass shooting, was a singer in a porno grind band, which was a very misogynist type of hate music. So there's hatecore, there's porno grind, there's National Socialist black music, black metal music. The genres have taken on different new names. In England, it really started with punk rock and then went to oi music, O-I exclamation point. And some of the oi music became very racist in nature and very extremist in nature. So it crosses genres. The record companies and distributors that sell this music usually carry all types. Some of them specialize. Just this past week, the Homeland Security Department of the United States declared or sent out a bulletin warning of domestic terrorists. And those are the very people that listen to this kind of music. When you look at what happened in our country's capital on January 6th, you saw one person wearing a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt, which is very anti-Semitic, another person carrying a Confederate flag, which was very racist. And these people are, in some cases, driven by this music. When we hear about mass shootings, and we've had a lot of them in our country, there's a lot of times, they point to violent video games or gun control and the availability of guns and movies and all kinds of things as being possible root causes of that thinking. But music hasn't been really identified as a major contributor, and I think it should be.
Oh, absolutely. When we think about just music therapy and the profession of utilizing different lyrics and musicality to help support someone's goals and needs, I don't think it's a far stretch at all to think that those same musical characteristics can have negative effects on a person. And we often talk at regional conferences and within our different areas of the country, like the Western region, the Midwest region, all these different areas of, be mindful of causing harm. But I think your book and what we're discussing today is a really great example of how harm can come from music. So my question would be, in the way that the civil rights movement kind of challenged people musically within the lyrics to go out and make change and stand up for what you believe in. I mean, we have examples like Marvin Gaye, Sam Cooke, all these really revolutionary musicians. I'm curious to know, have these hate groups taken that idea of freedom and being represented and twisted that and morphed it into kind of their own anthems for the marginalization of other groups or perpetuating white supremacy or anti-Semitism or racism? And most of all, are they actively calling people out and saying, one day we are going to claim our country back, or have these really mutated ways of thinking that are potentially very harmful, and if not outwardly, certainly internally, towards preventing our country and our nation and the world from being more equitable?
Oh, another really good question. A part of what I did to research my book was I went back to the historical sheet music archives, and I found that what I would now call hate music has existed back into the 1700s and 1800s, and there certainly were songs written and were popular songs that used a lot of the 5 characteristics that I've identified for hate music. But back then, one of the terms I learned in my research is zeitgeist. Zeitgeist means it's the culture of a time. So back then, that the culture was more accepting of those kinds of things. My observation is that over the past 4 or 5 years, it's become much more calls to violence, much more threatening. It has actually triggered a number of incidents of violence, up to including murder, but burning of churches and attacks on synagogues. And some of the instigators have definitely talked about how the music hooked them and got them motivated to be violent. When I look at some of the band names that I researched, like one band was named Jew Slaughter, another one was named Brutal Attack, another one was named Fueled by Hate, another one was named Code of Violence. So they're not often real subtle about encouraging acting out. And so it is definitely out there. And even though I told you the Anti-Defamation League estimated between 100 and 150 bands, that was, I think, 4 years ago that they made that estimate. I'm pretty sure it's gone up quite a bit since then.
Do you think that the influence of false information and national misinformation has been a cause or like a instigator in the rise in those numbers?
Absolutely. Misinformation and outright lies have really contributed. One part of my book, I was researching a woman and I was interviewing someone in Northern California. And we got there before my interview, and my wife and I were just walking around the town that we were in, and we happened upon the International Museum of Propaganda, which was not known to us, but we walked in and it was a collection of art gathered over 30 years from North Korea, Nazi Germany, the United States, some South American countries, all showing how they used misinformation and lies to gain power, political power, and to influence people, and to also attack people that were opposed to their either political or other beliefs. So, yeah, I think misinformation, in the bulletin that Homeland Security put out this past week, they talk about false narratives being a source of some of our extremist groups.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for filling us in on the historical context of this propaganda, but also for kind of letting us know more about the recent health administration's views on it as well. It does sound like this misinformation has a very direct role in the violence, as you've said, and hate that we see happening in the world, and that music could be a very legitimate threat to spreading this misinformation. Are there any articles or books that you read from your research that showed how hate music was specifically used to cause violence, or gave us examples of how it was being utilized by these hate groups?
Yes, one book I read was called American Swastika, written by a couple of sociologists who studied some extremist groups. And what amazed me about that book is all through the book, they talked about how music was used to recruit to these groups and to indoctrinate them with these belief systems and to provide a social context for them to get together. And build energy towards, in some cases, acting out violently. So again, it was another message to me that the music is not something to be minimized. It's really very strong in these movements.
All right. Well, yes, thank you for filling us in on this part of hate music and how misinformation can help to promote hate music and how hate music is kind of a reciprocal process of promoting those actions of violence. We're going to talk more on your book and many of the exciting things that are within the book right after this commercial break. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. On today's episode, we have Dr. Ted Thicken, and we just got done talking about the effects of the spread of misinformation on hate music and how hate music can help to promote violence. Now we're going to dive a little bit more into his book, which is Music of Hate, Music for Healing. So, Ted, I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit more, give us hints as listeners about the stories within the book.
Sure. There are 14 pairs of stories, and the first story in each pair has to do with hate music, and the second story in each pair tells the story of a music therapist. So I tried to pair or combine each pair for a specific reason. Either the music therapist was from the demographic group that was being attacked by a certain kind of hate music, or maybe they were treating victims of a hate crime, or maybe they lived geographically in the same place where a hate music group lives. So it was a variety of reasons, but I'll give you some examples. So I mentioned the group Jew Slaughter, which was a punk rock group in Portland, Oregon. So I tell their story and how they got involved in hate music. And then I paired that with the story of a woman music therapist in Portland named Felice Wohlment. And Felice was born in Vienna, Austria, 1897. And she escaped from Vienna in 1938 because of anti-Semitic hate and the invading Nazis. So she came to the United States and eventually became a music therapist. She was the first story in my book because I actually knew her. When I was a young, new music therapist, I met her and had a lot of time with her. She was in her 80s, still working as a music therapist. Another example is I tell the story of a songwriter named Johnny Rebel. That's not his real name, but he wrote a series of what he called segregationist songs, which all expressed hatred towards Black people. And then I matched that with the story of DeForia Lane, who is a Black music therapist who won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Music Therapy Association. I tell the story of Jared Lee Loughner, who is the person who shot Congresswoman Gabby Giffords in the head, and he had been listening to hate music, which did not include all of the 5 characteristics, but it definitely included the song "Let the Bodies Hit the Floor." He had definitely developed a hatred of Gabby Giffords. And then I tell the story of Megan Morrow, who treated Gabby Giffords and helped her regain speech. And on and on. Another example is I talk about anti-immigrant music. One of the songs I found, the last line in the song was, "Let's make America great again. Let's be free to hate again," which I thought was eye-opening. And I matched that with the story of a Russian immigrant who came to the United States from Central Russia and now works to help Afghan refugees assimilate in the United States. So let's see, I can give you another example. I talk about Jamaican murder music. That's not my label. That's a label that is prominent in some of the literature. It's music that attacks the LGBTQ plus community. And I paired that with the story of Spencer Hardy, who's a transgender music therapist who also works very hard to help other LGBT people with any issues that they have. So, there's 14 sets of stories. I won't go through all 14 of them, but they're matched. And then at the end of the book, the last chapter is, here's what you might have learned from all these stories, and here are my recommendations going forward. Most of my recommendations are for the general public. When I talk to music therapists privately or in groups, I have more specific recommendations for music therapists.
Well, there's so many incredible stories in the world, I know, for both hate music and for music therapists. I mean, we carry a variety of identities as people, and the integration of those identities can tell different stories. So how did you go about selecting the music therapist stories to share, or which groups to feature in the book?
I interviewed a lot of people. Some of it was based on who I had access to. But there were some people I interviewed that I did not include in the book. So I was selective, again, trying to match in some way the story of the music therapist with the type of hate music I was writing about. I wanted to give readers a chance to really compare and contrast the two different approaches to using music. And I wanted there to be a connection between the two stories in some way. Some of the connections are really obvious and really potent, but in others are a little bit less obvious, a little more subtle. But that's how I selected them. A couple of them were music therapy pioneers. So some of the stories have a historic quality to them. Here's what we could learn from the history of the past about hate. When you look at the Holocaust, two of the women in my book lived through the Holocaust and came to America and eventually became very, very active music therapy pioneers. So I did go back in history for a couple of the people. Most of them are present day. I think music therapists will recognize some of the names of the people I write about because they're prominent music therapists. I did not personally know a lot of their backstories. I knew that they were well-known music therapists, but I didn't know how they got into the field or why they got into the field. So I wanted to learn their backstories. And they all cooperated with me and participated in interviews and were anxious for me to tell their stories too.
What a great resource for finding that type of information too. What do you find in the value of featuring more current history as well as history of the past for some of those pioneers?
Well, some things never change. We all hate. That's the point I make when I talk to groups. You might hate a certain kind of food. You might hate the snow. You might, not really care for one of your coworkers or your boss. We all have experienced those negative emotions, but we all love too. And so my book is really a pro-love book. It talks about forgiveness. It talks about how to help hate musicians. There's a group that I talk about in the book called Life After Hate, which was formed by a number of former haters who all were active in the hate music movement. Some of them were lead singers in bands. Some of them owned publishing companies that promoted hate music. They have formed this group called Life After Hate, and they've all written books, so I read all of their books. They talk about how they came to discover that their thinking was false, and now they're trying to help other people get out of hate groups. So people like Christian Picciolini, he has a series on cable called Breaking Hate. Arno Michaelis, T.J. Layden, Frank Meek. These are all people that were active in mostly the white supremacist neo-Nazi movement that came to disavow those beliefs and are now helping other people get out of those groups. As a therapist, that was real important to me because I wanted to believe that people can change and people can get help and it can be successful. And I know that music therapists might encounter these types of clients. And so we need to know how to help them if they come to us for help.
To speak on that, what is one of the big changes that occurred in, maybe there's a general theme in those people's lives once they realized, hey, what I've been doing is not okay? Is there like specific stories that they mentioned, or is there trends?
Well, I'll talk about Frank Meek. He was a neo-Nazi skinhead, very active on the East Coast, and got into trouble with drugs and with criminal behavior and was in prison. And he was invited by some Black inmates to join their Bible study group. And he was surprised that they would welcome him and share with him and treat him with respect. When he got out of prison, he got hired by a Jewish businessman who treated him really fairly. And they discovered that they had a common interest in ice hockey. So he learned by having contact with Blacks and by having contacts with Jewish people that there was no reason to hate them as a group. And so he started learning more about it and reached out and finally gave up those beliefs. Christian Picciolini, who was in the upper Midwest, he again was recruited to a hate group and was he was a singer in a rock band called White American Youth. He started a record store, and he said, these people started coming into my record store. There were gays, there were Jews, there were Blacks, there were women, there were all these people were coming in. And he said, and I liked them. I really liked them. And he started thinking, why did I hate these people? They're such nice people to me. There's a variety of reasons. People get exposure to other groups. Their families don't give up on them. That's another reason. They grow up, and maybe they were going through adolescent rebelliousness and wanted to do something exciting or important, and then they discover that as they grow older that it doesn't hold true for them anymore. Some of them have children, and that's a big thing to them because they look at their innocent children and they suddenly go, I don't want to teach them how to hate like I do or like I did. Or sometimes it's the women in their life. The women start saying, I don't like being treated like a sex object, and I don't like being treated as an inferior. And so you need to change your ways. And they influence them. Although there are women involved in some of these extremist groups too. A lot of hate musicians and a lot of members of hate groups, and this is a gross generalization, but a lot of them were traumatized in their youth. They were bullied. They were abused by their parents. They might have had parents that were into drugs or alcohol. They might have been rejected by the opposite sex. And so they were ripe. They were angry at the world for how they were being treated. And they recruited to hate groups, not really necessarily believing in the belief system, but they just wanted a place to belong and to feel included. To me, that's real important to music therapists and music educators and other musicians. Reach out to those disenfranchised young people and get them involved in music, make them feel included.
Well, it kind of sounds like it's similar to the trend with like gang culture as well. A lot of people, it's either join that group or you won't survive kind of through isolation or through being targeted. So I find some really interesting connections in the world as you're speaking.
There's one record company, Panzerfaust Records, that actually had a campaign called their Schoolyard Campaign. And what they did was they produced like 10,000 CDs of hate music and distributed them free to middle school and high school students. And the owner of that company said, we not only entertain racists, we create them. Music is used to feed this ideology to some hate groups and also to recruit them.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Hearing that just sounds unbelievable to me. But thank you for getting that type of information out to the public and letting them know that these are active groups that still exist today. It's not like in the past.
Yes.
So we've spoken a little bit about how everybody can get something out of this book. I was wondering what kind of influence your your history as a certified professional in healthcare quality, how that related to the subject of the book then.
All of my background relates to it. So my music therapy degrees gave me a music therapy perspective. My doctorate is in public health. So that gave me a perspective of, is hate music a public health issue, which I think it is. And I'm a certified professional in healthcare quality, and that teaches me that things can always be improved. You need to look for root causes. You need to look for how can we address those root causes and how can we improve this situation. I also mentioned at the beginning how I started in a church boys choir. So certainly growing up, going to church influenced me to focus more on love and forgiveness. So everything that goes into making us a person and all of our biases probably come out in my book. I tried to be fair and to report both sides equally, but my recommendations are pretty much what can we do to use music in more positive ways.
And I could see that in the way that you spoke on addressing the negative effects of hate music. That being said, I can't help from my experiences to look at it from a therapeutic perspective. You said one of the biggest changes among, growing up, kind of realizing that you don't have that same perspective, but with some of your examples was the integration with different groups, such as owning that bookstore or getting to experience other cultures. So in a therapeutic context, this may be a difficult question. How can we pose a situation in which you could interact with different groups that those groups are still safe? So I'm thinking, for instance, like a jam band where you'd have groups of different races, gender identities, etc., all integrated. But how can you guarantee like they are in a safe position to get those interactions? Or is that counter to kind of what you're saying?
I think that the key to getting groups together to know each other better will always be helpful. It's really hard to change someone's opinion, and it's really hard to, change their life's experiences and why they believe what they believe, but it's not impossible. One of the stories in my book is a Black musician who was playing, I think, in a bar, maybe a bar in the South, and a man approached him after his performance and said, can I buy you a drink? I really love how you were playing that bass line. And so he sat down. He was Black, and the man offering him a drink was white. The man said, I've never done this before. I've never offered a Black man a drink. And the Black man said, well, why? And he said, well, because I'm a member of the KKK. So they got talking and sharing, and then they started inviting other friends to come and share. And I think last I checked, there were like maybe 18 KKK members that quit the KKK and gave the Black musician their hoods and their robes. So it was just a matter of getting to know each other. I think, getting community choirs. One idea I had, which I haven't implemented, is something called community rounds, where you invite all of these diverse groups to come together to just sing rounds together. So they harmonize together. You don't have to talk. You don't have to confront each other. You don't have to discuss, just harmonize together and see what effect that has. But we certainly need to learn more about groups that we're not a part of. We need to know our own genealogy histories and what our ancestors had to deal with and what these other groups. I have children that live in just outside of Washington, D.C. So when I visit them, I've gone to the Holocaust Museum and the African American Museum and the Native American Museum, really learn about what these groups have been through and challenge your biases that you have. Especially as music therapists, we should be treating people without biases. So we need to be aware of them and then how to challenge them.
Yeah, I think especially for a lot of new clinicians, something that, and I can see this in either practicum students, interns, is this idea that we need to fix something about the person as opposed to inviting them and giving them the space to to make their own like life decisions. And all we're doing is supporting that process of discovery and influence. Obviously, if they need to achieve a certain goal, we'll give them the supports to do that. But yeah, it kind of reminds me of that, and not necessarily telling them go this way, but giving them the resources to choose for themselves.
Yeah, I think people come to therapy for a reason. Something's not working, either emotionally or physically or medically. That's not their whole person. So one of the people I interviewed for my book, Ron Borzon, who's at Cal State University, Northridge, he's the music therapy professor there. He said, I know that people recover, and I know that people make mistakes, and that's just a part of them. You know, alcoholics and drug addicts find sobriety. So you can't judge the whole person by one problem area, and you have to help them with that problem area.
So let's say, all this has already happened. They're starting to make the road, like people who produce hate music, they're starting to make the road towards changing their point of view or perspective. As somebody who's experienced that, and maybe you can draw from those that you interviewed in the book, why would they forgive these people who have so much hate, who have hurt other people as well?
One of the stories in my book is the story of a gay boy who was attacked by neo-Nazi white supremacists and almost killed in Southern California. And this was like 30 years ago, maybe. So recently, he's been working for the Forgiveness Project, which is an organization in Southern California that helps people give forgiveness for other behaviors. And he was presenting with another person, and they discovered, kind of by accident, that the other person was one of his attackers 30 years earlier. And as they both told their stories, they discovered this, that, yeah, you almost killed me. Yeah, I almost killed you. And now they are working for the Forgiveness Project. So they went through therapy. They did a lot of personal work individually and together, and they came to a point of forgiveness. And now they speak out and encourage other people in that way too. A gentleman named Tony McAleer wrote a book called The Cure for Hate. And he was also involved in the white supremacist, neo-Nazi skinhead movement. He was also very involved with Resistance Records, which is one of the big hate music record companies. And in his book about The Cure for Hate, he talks about his own therapy and what it meant to him and how he had to forgive himself before he could forgive others. He recommends never appealing to someone intellectually. He said you need to appeal to their heart, not to their mind. And he said for him, when people started pulling at his heartstrings, that's what made him change. It wasn't arguing with him about his belief systems.
Wow. I think that's a really impactful takeaway from today. And what an amazing thing to share that, and for him to go through those experiences and then feel open enough to share his therapeutic process with the world.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today to speak with me and to the listeners to inform us about your book, all of the research that you've done into it, and all of these experiences that you've gathered from. Is there any last things you'd like to share about the book, or any other resources you'd like to plug for people to get in contact with you?
Sure. My book is available. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes & Noble. It can be ordered from any bookstore through it's called Ingram Spark. That's the company that sells to bookstores. It's available both in paperback and as an ebook. I have a website. It's tedthickenmusic.org. And you can go there and you can leave me messages. You can see where I'm speaking. You can see more about the book. And I also have some recommended books on that website, some of the books I read in my research. Also, so I recommend some organizations, like I mentioned, the Southern Poverty Law Center and Anti-Defamation League and the Forgiveness Project. You can click on the links to those organizations on my website. So thank you so much for letting me talk about the book. I'm really trying to get word out about it. I think it's very timely with what's going on in our country.
Yes, absolutely. I think we could all benefit from reading a little bit about others' experiences.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Once again, the title of that book is Music of Hate, Music for Healing, Paired Stories from the Hate Music Industry and the Profession of Music Therapy. Thank you all for listening to Voices of Music Therapy, and tune in to our next episode. If you'd like to see today's guest or learn more about the show, check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Voices of Music Therapy or on Twitter at VOMT Podcast. If you have any questions or if you know any innovative music therapists and would like to recommend them for the show, you can email us at voicesofmusictherapy@gmail.com.